This is Plant-Based Briefing, the Switch4Good Theory of Change, Part 2 by Switch4Good.org. And I'm Marian Erickson, host of this curated content plant-based podcast. I narrate articles with permission on a variety of plant-based and vegan topics in about 10 minutes or less every weekday. And today's article was longer than that, so it's a two-parter, and I read part 1 yesterday, and here's part 2 today. So if you haven't listened to yesterday's episode, go back and do that first, and then come back here for part 2. So now let's get to today's plant-based briefing. The Switch4Good Theory of Change, Part 2 by Switch4Good.org. Our theory of change, dairy as a catalyst. A sustained and focused effort on shifting cultural perceptions regarding dairy will open doors for the plant-based movement, creating greater opportunities and magnified impact for all organizations working on health initiatives, climate change, and animal welfare. Plainly stated, dairy is the first domino to fall in a path to a sustainable plant-based future. As bold as the above statement is, this theory is not arrived at without careful consideration. Underpinned by a number of calculated assumptions that are outlined below, Switch4Good is focused on delivering measurable objectives that put us on the path to real societal change, upending traditional diet change, unifying motivations, and diet change as empowerment. Upending traditional diet change. Quote, "Fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you," unquote. Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The calculus on what makes for effective intervention is complex. One way to approach the problem is to focus on where the most suffering lies. In the scope of animal agriculture, suffering is most profound in the billions of chickens and fish who are killed each year. But what about the human element? Not all forms of intervention are going to be viewed the same by the public, and no measurable improvements in animal agriculture can be made without the public's buy-in, as society very literally votes for animal suffering with its wallet. By changing perceptions, we can prime our potential allies to join us in the monumental task before us. Market trends are showing us that non-dairy options are gaining traction among the general public. It is there where we must focus our efforts to achieve a critical mass of support for the movement, and to do that, we need to upend the traditional model of change. If you ask a former omnivore to describe their journey to a plant-based lifestyle, you're likely to get a variation of the following progression. Most omnivores first limit their red meat intake, followed by other meats such as chicken and fish. Often, eggs, milk, and cheese are the last remaining animal products to be eliminated from one's diet before the transition is complete. In fact, it is likely that many people find this last step to be the hardest part of the transition, in part because dairy products like cheese are often used as substitutes in meals where meat was heavily featured. There's also a disconnect between people and food. While it's clear that eating meat leads to killing animals, it's less obvious that animal products also contribute to an immense amount of suffering and death. Switch4Good is turning this model of progressive diet change on its head. By meeting omnivores with dairy-free messaging, we can provide a new path to a plant-based diet. Once the most tractable plant-based options become part of a transitioning omnivore's everyday life, those people will be much more likely to be receptive to and even seek out plant-based options that eliminate other forms of animal products. On measuring diet change. Like other behavior-based social movements, it can be difficult to identify supporters' efforts to put new ideas into practice, and even more difficult to figure out which of those ideas can be credited to our interventions. Switch4Good is working on developing a multi-pronged approach that comprises self-reported data, market trends, and supporter engagement to answer this question. We always welcome thoughts, recommendations, or collaborations to improve the way we collect and analyze data. Unifying motivations. As with any movement, garnering widespread support from stakeholders with varied backgrounds and experiences is key to creating societal change. This is why Switch4Good's theory of change relies on understanding the current plant-based movement and identifying key ways to turn weaknesses into strengths. Much of the current messaging around plant-based diets is focused on altruistic motivations. Current plant-based supporters are likely to claim reduction in animal suffering or a desire to positively impact climate change as the reason they made the switch. Switch4Good is focused on reaching a new audience. Most people identify self-interest as a primary motivator for their choices. By leaning into that motivation through education and research that shows that a dairy-free lifestyle can increase performance, reduce illness and injury, and help achieve goals, Switch4Good is locked into a still untapped market of future dairy-free supporters. Furthermore, Switch4Good is capitalizing on sleek, athlete-forward marketing to deliver a new message to potential plant-based supporters. Dairy-free isn't just healthy, it's cool. Much like the Got Milk campaign found mainstream success through the use of athletes, Switch4Good's messaging will create a dairy-free persona for a new generation. And lastly, diet change as empowerment. Diet change can be about so much more than doing something good for animals, the planet, and your health. Making informed decisions about your body is a form of empowerment. And when a product like dairy, which makes 1/3 of Americans and 2/3 of the globe sick, is promoted as healthy, people are robbed of the ability to make informed choices for themselves. By educating the public about the reality of dairy, providing research that allows everyone to explore the truth for themselves, and directly addressing power structures whose policies put communities of color at a disadvantage, we can make dairy-free more than a healthy choice. We can make it a call for justice. You just listened to the Switch4Good Theory of Change, Part 2, by Switch4Good.org, and I'm Marian Erickson, host of the Plant-Based Briefing. I think this is such a good approach, and I'm so glad organizations like Switch4Good and others like them are going after dairy. I was vegetarian for about 20 years and had no clue that I was harming animals or the environment, of course, by eating dairy and eggs. And I know I'm not alone in that. There are countless vegetarians around the world, individuals, religious communities who choose to not eat animal flesh, but don't give any thought to dairy and eggs. A Prayer for Compassion is a great documentary that touches on that a fair bit, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. And this ties into something Dr. Sailesh Rao had said when I was being interviewed by him on his Climate Healers Moonshot podcast. And we each talked about how we'd been vegetarian for many years before we knew the truth about dairy and eggs. He had been vegetarian for 48 years before he knew the truth. But he referred to dairy and eggs as the keystone of animal agriculture. And without them, the whole thing falls apart. It ties into the Switch4Good theory of change that we just heard about. It also reminds me when I do street activism, showing footage of standard industry practice animal agriculture. When people come up and inquire what we're doing, vegetarians will often say, "Oh, you don't have to talk to me, I'm on your side." But in fact, we say, "No, you're our target." Vegetarians should be easy to educate and convert to a cruelty-free vegan lifestyle, because presumably they're vegetarian because they care about animal rights and welfare, but most don't know what the dairy and the egg industry are really about. And the new Milked documentary that came out is fantastic. You can watch it free on YouTube. I'll put a link in the show notes. One thing I was really surprised to learn was the plight of the farmers. They are caught up in this system as well. So I realized that while I already have a number of reasons I'm vegan, including the animals, of course, world hunger, pandemics, antibiotics, health, forests, oceans, wildlife, biodiversity loss, climate change. Even with all that, I now am adding farmers to my list of why I live vegan. So check out the Milked documentary, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And please share this episode with anyone who might benefit, and thanks for listening.